Someone spoke about you when you were nowhere near the room, and what they said was not casual, not careless, and not something they expected anyone else to remember. There was a moment when your name came up, and suddenly, the person you love became quieter. They tried to hide what they were feeling. They changed the subject. They looked away. But something inside them had already been exposed. Because when they finally spoke honestly about you, they revealed a feeling they have been carrying much longer than you realize. And there is one part of that secret conversation that you were never supposed to hear. Yet somehow, your heart may have already sensed it. Stay with me, because what was said next changes the meaning of everything you thought you knew about their silence. There are feelings people express openly, and then there are feelings they protect so carefully that even their closest friends never hear the truth. Your soulmate has been living somewhere between those two worlds. On the outside, they may have appeared composed. Maybe even distant. Maybe they acted as though your absence did not affect them as deeply as it really did. But behind that calm appearance was a conversation they could not completely control. Someone asked about you. And instead of giving the easy answer, they paused. That pause said more than a long explanation ever could. Because there are certain names that do not simply enter a person's mind. They enter the heart. Your name was one of them. At first, they tried to speak logically. They may have mentioned circumstances, timing, distance, misunderstandings, or the things that made the connection complicated. But then something shifted. Their voice became softer. Their defenses began to disappear. And for a brief moment, they stopped pretending they had everything figured out. They admitted that you had affected them differently. Not because you chased them. Not because you demanded their attention. But because something about you remained with them even when you were not present. A memory. A conversation. A look. A moment they thought they had forgotten. And perhaps the strangest part is that they did not talk about you like someone from their past. They talked about you like someone whose presence was still emotionally unfinished. That is where the conversation became personal. Someone wanted to know why you still mattered so much. And your soulmate gave an answer that revealed far more than they intended. They explained that there was something about you they could not easily replace. Not your appearance. Not your attention. Something deeper. The way you made them feel seen without forcing them to explain themselves. The way your presence could quiet something inside them. The way even your silence seemed to communicate something words could not. But then came the question they were not prepared for. If you feel this strongly, why haven't you told them? Silence. Longer than before. And this time, they could not hide behind an excuse. Because deep down, they knew the truth. They were afraid. Not necessarily afraid of you. Afraid of what would happen if they finally admitted everything. What if you no longer felt the same? What if too much time had passed? What if the walls they built around their heart came down and there was nothing left to protect them? And then, they said something that revealed the deepest part of their struggle. They admitted that sometimes they wonder whether you still think about them. Imagine that. The person you may have believed had forgotten you was privately wondering whether you had forgotten them. That realization carries a different kind of weight. Because perhaps their silence was never proof that they stopped caring. Perhaps it was evidence of an internal battle you could not see. They have been trying to understand why your connection still reaches them in unexpected moments. A song. A familiar place. A quiet evening. A memory appearing without warning. And every time it happens, they ask themselves the same question. Why am I still feeling this? But there is another layer to this story. The person listening to their confession noticed something in their expression. Something they could not explain away. Because when your soulmate spoke about you, there was no bitterness in their voice. There was tenderness. Regret. And something dangerously close to hope. That is what made the conversation unforgettable. They were not simply remembering you. They were imagining what could still happen. And that is when they revealed the one thought they had kept hidden even from themselves. A thought they have probably repeated in private more times than they would ever admit. What if I was wrong about us? That question changes everything. Because once someone begins questioning the decision that separated them from the person they deeply care about, they can no longer return completely to the emotional place they were in before. Something has shifted. Something has awakened. And the secret conversation did not end there. Because just when they thought they had said enough, someone asked them one final question. A question so direct that they became completely silent. And the answer they eventually gave may explain why you have felt an invisible emotional pull toward them lately. But what they said next was not a confession of love. It was something even more revealing. It was an admission about what they are afraid might happen if they lose you for good. And that is where the story takes an unexpected turn. There are moments when a person can hide their feelings from everyone except the one question that keeps returning when the room becomes quiet. And your soulmate had reached that moment. When they were asked what they feared most about losing you, they did not answer immediately. They looked down. They took a breath. And then they admitted something they had never wanted to say out loud. They were afraid that one day you would stop caring completely. Not because they wanted to control you. Not because they expected you to wait forever. But because somewhere inside them, they knew you had already given them something precious, something they had not fully appreciated when they had the chance. Your patience. Your understanding. Your emotional presence. And now they were beginning to wonder whether they had mistaken your quietness for indifference. That realization hit them harder than they expected. Because they remembered moments when you could have demanded answers, but didn't. Times when you could have walked away angrily, but chose peace. Moments when you were probably hurting more than they realized, yet still managed to carry yourself with dignity. And suddenly, the silence between you began to look different. It was no longer an empty space. It was filled with everything neither of you had said. Your soulmate confessed that they sometimes replay certain conversations in their mind. Not because they enjoy living in the past. But because they keep finding new meanings in words they once dismissed. A sentence you said casually may now sound completely different to them. A look they barely noticed at the time may now feel unforgettable. Even a goodbye that seemed ordinary may have become one of the memories they secretly wish they could rewrite. And then something happened that nobody in that conversation expected. They defended you. Someone questioned whether you had really meant what you said. Whether you were sincere. Whether the connection had simply been a temporary emotional chapter. And your soulmate immediately pushed back. They said, in their own way, that people did not understand you. That they had seen a side of you most people never get to see. That beneath your strength was a heart that had probably endured more than you ever talked about. And for the first time, they were not simply talking about missing you. They were protecting your name. That matters. Because people can say they miss someone while still remaining uncertain about what that person meant. But when someone begins defending your character when you are not even there to hear it, their feelings have moved into a deeper place. There was something else in their voice, though. Something almost painful. They admitted that they had wondered whether you deserved someone who could love you more openly than they had. Think about that. They were not questioning your worth. They were questioning whether they had been worthy of the love you were capable of giving. And that thought may explain some of the distance you experienced. Sometimes people do not pull away because they feel nothing. Sometimes they retreat because feeling something real forces them to confront the parts of themselves they have avoided. Your soulmate may have discovered that loving you required more honesty than they were prepared to offer. More courage. More vulnerability. More responsibility. And instead of facing that truth immediately, they hid behind silence. But silence has a strange way of revealing what words conceal. Eventually, someone asked them whether they would ever tell you all of this. The room became quiet again. And this time, their answer was different. They did not say yes. They did not say no. They simply said they did not know if they still had the right to come back into your life. That sentence carried something heavy. Because it suggested they were not only thinking about their own feelings anymore. They were thinking about your heart. They were wondering whether you had healed. Whether you had moved forward. Whether reopening this connection would bring you peace, or disturb the peace you had fought so hard to create. And then came the confession that changed the entire conversation. They said that if they ever approached you again, they would not want to come with empty promises. They would want to come with clarity. That statement reveals something important. They are beginning to understand that emotions alone are not enough. Missing someone is easy. Thinking about someone is easy. Even saying, "I love you," can be easy. But showing up differently, that requires transformation. And perhaps that is what has been happening quietly inside them. While you were living your life, they were confronting memories. While you were trying to understand the silence, they were trying to understand themselves. While you wondered whether the connection meant anything, they were privately asking whether they had made the biggest emotional mistake of their life. But there is one detail from that secret conversation that makes everything even more intriguing. Before the discussion ended, your soulmate was asked what they would say if you suddenly appeared in front of them. For several seconds, they said nothing. Then they finally answered. Not with a grand declaration. Not with a dramatic promise. Just a few words that revealed how deeply your absence had affected them. They said they would want you to know that they never truly stopped caring. And then their voice changed. Because they added something else. They said there was a part of them that still hoped you had not completely closed the door. That was the moment everyone in the room understood. This was not simply nostalgia. This was unfinished emotion. But there is a reason they have not told you everything yet. A reason they are still holding one particular truth behind their silence. And that truth has almost nothing to do with whether they love you. It has to do with what they discovered about themselves after you were gone. Because the next thing they revealed was not about the past at all. It was about the future they secretly imagined. And once you hear what they said they would do differently this time, you may finally understand why their feelings have remained hidden for so long. Something changed inside them after that conversation ended, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the kind of quiet way that changes a person's decisions before anyone else can see it. They went home carrying your name in their thoughts. And for the first time, they were not asking, "Do I still love this person?" They already knew the answer. The question had become much harder. Am I finally ready to love them the way they deserve? That question followed them into the silence. Because remembering you was no longer enough. They began thinking about the moments when fear had made them hesitate, the words they swallowed, the opportunities they allowed to pass because they convinced themselves there would always be another chance. But suddenly, another chance no longer felt guaranteed. And that realization unsettled them. They understood something about you that they had not understood before. You were not waiting in the same emotional place forever. You were growing. You were becoming stronger. You were learning how to live without needing someone else to validate your worth. And somewhere deep inside, your soulmate realized that if they ever returned, they could not expect the old version of you to simply open the door. They would have to meet the person you had become. That thought frightened them. But it also gave them hope. Because they remembered something about you that had always stayed with them. You never needed to be the loudest person in the room to leave an impression. You had a quiet strength. The kind people sometimes underestimate until they realize they can no longer reach you the way they once could. And your soulmate began to understand that your silence was not weakness. It was a boundary. A message without words. It said, "I care, but I cannot keep abandoning myself." That realization struck them deeply. They began questioning the choices they had made. Not with self-pity. With honesty. They thought about what they would change if they could return to those moments. They would listen longer. They would explain instead of disappearing. They would stop pretending they were unaffected. And most importantly, they would stop making you guess what was happening inside their heart. That was the future they secretly imagined. Not some perfect fantasy where every problem magically disappears. Something more real. A conversation where neither person has to hide. A connection where affection does not have to be decoded. A relationship where silence is not used as protection. But there was still one obstacle. You. They did not know what you would say. And that uncertainty was becoming impossible for them to ignore. One night, they found themselves thinking about the possibility of hearing your voice again. Just imagining it brought back emotions they thought they had buried. They wondered whether you would sound warm. Whether you would sound distant. Whether you would even answer. And then another thought entered their mind. What if they have finally moved on? That possibility hurt more than they expected. Because deep down, they had been relying on an invisible assumption. That somehow, some part of you would always remember them. But now they were beginning to understand that memories do not give anyone ownership over another person's future. If they wanted another opportunity, they could not simply expect it. They would have to earn it. And that realization was the beginning of something new. Your soulmate started thinking less about what they wanted from you, and more about what they would need to give. That is a powerful change. Because genuine love eventually forces a person to move beyond longing. Longing says, I miss you. Maturity says, I want to become someone safe enough for you to trust again. And somewhere between those two emotions, your soulmate began changing the way they saw your entire connection. They remembered your imperfections. Your difficult moments. Your misunderstandings. The things that had frustrated them. And somehow, they did not make the feelings disappear. Instead, they made the connection feel more real. Because they were no longer idealizing you. They were remembering you as a complete human being. And that made their feelings harder to dismiss. Then came the moment that may explain why they finally spoke about you so openly in secret. Someone asked them whether they believed the two of you still had a chance. Your soulmate did not answer immediately. But this time, the silence felt different. It was not fear. It was consideration. Then they said something that revealed the hope they had been protecting. They said they did not know what the future would bring. But if life gave them another opportunity to speak to you honestly, they would not waste it. That sentence stayed in the room. And perhaps it stayed in their heart too. Because they finally admitted what they had been avoiding. They still had something to say to you. Something they had never properly explained. Something that could change the way you remember the past. But there is one final piece of that secret confession. The part they almost refused to reveal. It was not about why they missed you. It was not about why they were afraid. And it was not even about whether they wanted you back. It was about the one moment when they realized that losing your presence had changed them. And what they secretly wished they could tell you if they were standing directly in front of you. That confession is where everything becomes deeply personal. Because the words they were afraid to say were never really about the past. They were about you. For a long time, they thought the hardest part would be admitting that they still cared. They were wrong. The hardest part was admitting what your absence had taught them. Because when someone leaves your life, you do not always understand their importance immediately. Sometimes it takes ordinary days, quiet nights, familiar places suddenly feeling different, before the truth finally catches up with you. And that is exactly what happened to your soulmate. They began noticing the spaces where you used to exist. Not physically. Emotionally. There were thoughts they could no longer share with you. Little things they once would have told you without thinking. Moments when they instinctively wanted to reach for their phone, only to stop. And every time they stopped themselves, they were forced to face the same realization. You had become part of their inner world. Even when you were not part of their daily life. That realization was uncomfortable. Because it meant they could no longer dismiss what they felt as a passing emotion. Then one evening, something unexpectedly brought you back into their thoughts. It may have been a song. A familiar phrase. A place. Or simply one of those strange moments when memory arrives without permission. And suddenly, they remembered something very specific about you. The way you cared when nobody was watching. The way you noticed things other people overlooked. The way you could make someone feel important without asking for recognition. And that memory opened a door they had spent a long time keeping closed. Behind that door was regret. Not regret that you existed in their life. Regret that they had not understood your value while they still had easy access to your heart. They began asking themselves questions they had avoided for too long. Why did I hold back? Why did I make them question my feelings? Why did I allow fear to speak louder than love? And then came the realization that hurt the most. You had probably spent more time wondering whether they cared than they had spent actually showing you that they did. That truth humbled them. Because love that remains hidden can still be genuine. But hidden love cannot comfort someone who is standing in the dark wondering whether they matter. Your soulmate finally understood that. And that understanding changed the confession they had been carrying. They no longer wanted to tell you only that they missed you. They wanted you to know that they understood what their silence had cost. They understood that every unanswered question had a weight. Every delayed conversation created distance. Every moment they chose pride over vulnerability left another crack in the connection. And yet, there was something beautiful hidden inside that painful realization. They were no longer blaming circumstances. They were taking responsibility. That is when their feelings became more honest than they had ever been before. They admitted that you had not been the difficult part of their story. Their own fear had been. Fear of rejection. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of losing control. Fear that if they gave you their whole heart, you would have the power to break it. So they protected themselves. And in protecting themselves, they may have pushed away the very person they wanted closest. That realization brought tears to their eyes. Not because they were weak. Because sometimes a person finally understands the consequences of their own silence. And this is where the secret conversation became even more revealing. Someone asked them, if you could tell them one thing without being interrupted, what would you say? They paused. For once, there was no carefully prepared answer. No excuse. No explanation. Just truth. They said they wished you knew that the distance never erased what they felt. They wished you knew that some of their quietest moments were actually filled with thoughts of you. They wished you knew that there were times they wanted to reach out but convinced themselves they had already waited too long. And then they admitted something even more vulnerable. They wondered whether you had ever cried because of them. That question exposed the depth of their regret. Because they were finally thinking beyond their own pain. They were imagining yours. They were wondering what their actions looked like from your side. And perhaps that is the greatest emotional shift of all. When someone stops asking, why did they leave? And starts asking, what did I make them feel? Your soulmate had reached that point. But then the conversation took another unexpected turn. Someone asked whether they would still choose you if they could go back. This time, they answered faster. Yes. But not because they believed everything would magically become perfect. They said they would choose the opportunity to know you again. Only this time, they would choose honesty sooner. They would speak when they were afraid. They would stay present during difficult conversations. They would not make you carry the emotional burden alone. And they would never again assume that your patience meant you would wait forever. Those words revealed something profound. They were not simply longing for the person you used to be. They were hoping for an opportunity to meet the person you are becoming. And that is why the secret they shared matters so much. Because somewhere along the way, your soulmate stopped seeing you as a chapter they had already finished, and started seeing you as a possibility they were not emotionally ready to release. But just when the conversation seemed to be ending, someone asked the question nobody expected. If you could stand in front of them right now, would you tell them everything? Your soulmate went completely still. And after a long silence, they gave an answer that nobody in that room was prepared to hear. They said there was one truth they had never told you because saying it would make them completely vulnerable. One sentence. One confession. One truth that could either reopen the door between you, or finally give them the courage to accept what they had lost. And the moment they finally said those words aloud, they realized there was no way to take them back. Because for the first time, they were no longer hiding their real feelings from the world. They were finally admitting them to themselves. The truth they finally admitted to themselves was not as simple as, "I miss them." It went much deeper. They realized they had been carrying a quiet hope that somehow, somewhere, life would bring you back into the same conversation. Not because they believed destiny would do all the work for them, but because they had never completely accepted the possibility of losing you emotionally. And that realization frightened them. Because hope can be comforting when it is distant. But once hope begins demanding action, a person has to decide whether they are brave enough to follow it. Your soulmate was standing at that exact crossroads. They could continue remembering you privately. They could keep replaying old conversations. They could wonder what might have happened. Or they could finally admit the one thing they had been avoiding. They wanted you to know the truth. Not a polished version. Not a carefully calculated confession. The truth. They wanted you to know that their feelings had survived the silence. That even when they tried to convince themselves they had moved forward, certain memories kept pulling them back to the emotional place where your connection still lived. And then they remembered something that changed the entire meaning of their confession. You never asked them to become someone else. You only wanted honesty. You wanted to know where you stood. You wanted actions to match words. And perhaps that was what made them realize how complicated their own behavior had been. They had spent so much time protecting their heart that they forgot you had a heart too. That thought stayed with them. It made them look at the past differently. The moments they once considered insignificant suddenly seemed important. The conversations they rushed through. The messages they left unanswered. The affection they assumed you already understood. They began seeing all of it through a different lens. And suddenly, they understood why you might have stepped back. Maybe you were not trying to punish them. Maybe you were simply tired of being the only one trying to understand what neither of you was saying. That possibility broke something open inside them. Because they realized your silence may have been the first time you chose yourself. And instead of resenting you for it, they respected you for it. That was a turning point. They began thinking about the kind of person they would need to be if they ever stood in front of you again. Not someone asking for another chance without changing. Not someone expecting you to forget everything. Someone willing to listen. Someone willing to answer difficult questions. Someone willing to let you decide what happens next. That is a very different kind of love. It is not possession. It is not desperation. It is respect. And that is what your soulmate was beginning to understand. But there was still something they could not escape. The fear that you might no longer want them. They wondered whether you had already healed from everything they once caused. Whether someone else had entered your life. Whether your heart had finally learned to feel peaceful without them. And although that thought hurt, they knew they had no right to demand that you remain emotionally available. So instead of asking, "Will they come back?" they began asking a more mature question. If they never come back, can I still be grateful that I knew them? That question changed everything. Because it meant their feelings were becoming less about getting something from you, and more about recognizing what you had meant to them. They admitted that meeting you had changed the way they understood connection. You had shown them that emotional intimacy was not about constant excitement. Sometimes it was about feeling safe enough to be honest. Sometimes it was about being understood without having to perform. Sometimes it was simply knowing that someone genuinely cared. And they realized they had experienced something rare with you. Something they could not easily explain to anyone else. That was why your name kept appearing in their private conversations. That was why memories of you still surfaced. That was why they had not been able to reduce the connection to a simple, what if? Because somewhere inside them, you had become part of the person they were becoming. But then came the most unexpected realization of all. They understood that if they ever spoke to you again, they could not begin with, "I miss you." They would have to begin with something much more honest. "I understand now." Those 3 words carried everything. I understand why you became quiet. I understand why you pulled away. I understand why you stopped explaining yourself. I understand that my uncertainty hurt you. I understand that you deserved clarity. And perhaps most importantly, I understand that loving someone means allowing them to choose. That was the maturity hidden beneath their secret confession. They were finally learning that your heart was not a place they could visit whenever they felt lonely. If they wanted to return, they would need to come with consistency. With honesty. With patience. With action strong enough to support the words they had avoided saying. And there was one more thing they secretly wished you could hear. They wished you knew that your absence had not made them forget you. It had made them understand you. There is a difference. When someone is present, we sometimes notice only what they do. When they are absent, we begin noticing what their presence meant. Your soulmate had finally reached that realization. But just as they thought they had said everything, one final memory came back to them. A moment involving you that they had almost completely forgotten. A moment so small that you may not even realize how deeply it affected them. And when they remembered it, their entire expression changed. Because suddenly they understood something about your connection that they had never been able to explain before. That memory was the reason they had never truly been able to let go. And what happened in that moment? What you said. And what they secretly felt but never told you. May be the most revealing part of this entire story. Because the truth they discovered there was not simply that they loved you. It was that, somewhere deep inside, they had already chosen you long before they had the courage to admit it.